I own 5 acres of land north of Durham, North Carolina, where I developed said land and put this tiny home on it that I'm currently staying in and plan on renting it out on Airbnb. And there were a ton of hiccups along the way in order to actually develop that land and get a legal certificate of occupancy, which I currently have. And about 2 or 3 months ago, I was potentially planning on selling this tiny home back to the person who sold it to me. But it ended up working out in the end, and so I wanted to create a video with all the steps that I went through and things I did not know. So if you plan on purchasing a tiny home, whether to rent out on Airbnb or live in yourself, some things that you can look out for when you're trying to do this legally. Obviously, if you're going to do it illegally, it's going to have a lot fewer steps and probably be a lot easier for you. My name's Avery. I'm a real estate investor and real estate agent in the Raleigh-Durham area of North Carolina, and I absolutely love real estate, and I would also love if you would scroll down and make that thumbs up button blue, and let's get right into it. So the first thing you're going to want to think about is actually where are you placing this tiny home? Are you going to buy some land, or are you going to have a property that has some land on it that you can develop? Personally, I chose the latter, and I have a cabin that I already list on Airbnb that had 5 acres of extra land that I could develop on it in order to put this tiny home on it. Now, I personally like that approach a lot easier because you already have a property, you can start making income from it, and while you're making income from it, then you can make these improvements to the land to put another structure on. Now, of course, before you purchase that property, you're going to need to know, are you legally allowed to add more property to said land, which goes along some other steps that I'm going to talk about later in the video. It's also a lot easier to get a loan for a plot of land that already has a home on it. Oftentimes, it's much more difficult to get a land loan or a loan on a manufactured home that has land on it. So typically, it's just a lot simpler if you're going to buy a property that has extra acreage but already a home set up on it. The other advantage about already having an existing home on this land was I was able to tap into one of the existing utilities, which was the well water. So I was able to run well water to the cabin that I have as well as to this property. One thing that I did have to add that I didn't think about was an extra pressure tank so that the water pressure was good both here and in the cabin. In step 2, the next thing you're going to want to consider is the actual tiny home that you plan on building or purchasing to put on this land. Personally, I bought a prefab tiny home, which was a tiny home on wheels, and I got it shipped here from a company based out of Tennessee called Nordic & Spruce. Now that was a process in and of itself, and it went decently okay. I really do wish that one thing I would have done before I actually purchased the prefab tiny home was drive out there and look at my specific unit, because typically with new construction, you are going to do a blue tape inspection is what it's called come the end of the actual construction. So you can go around and note what all the issues were. There were actually a really solid amount of issues with this specific tiny home, and the owner of the tiny home company ended up driving out here and fixing most of them. All in all, with zoning, it will probably be a lot easier if you build your own tiny home on the lot, although that may be more expensive and potentially you have different goals with this tiny home. Maybe you want to be able to move it from place to place, but if it does sit on a permanent foundation, it's going to be better for valuation perspective because I eventually plan to do a cash out refinance on this property. So if it were on wheels, they may not consider it any additional value or structure to the land that I own. And the other thing you want to make sure you do before you purchase or figure out what type of tiny home you want to do, again, it'll be easier if you build your own, but potentially more expensive, but you can make it a little bit more custom, is you want to speak with the county, because the county then viewed my tiny home on wheels as an RV, and in the state of North Carolina, you are not legally allowed to live in an RV or rent it out. So eventually I had to actually take it off the wheels, take it off the axle, get rid of the tongue, which is where the mini split system was sitting on, and put it on a permanent foundation, which was one expense that I was not expecting, which cost about an extra $5,000. Once you've figured out your tiny home and you've talked to your county about the specific type of property that you have, again, this is very important because originally I thought it was going to be one type of permit that I was going to get, but it ended up being a different one with different inspections because they called this home a mobile home. And so I had to do different inspections based on it being a mobile home, not an accessory structure, which is what they originally thought it was because they thought I was going to build a tiny home on site. But the next thing you're going to want to think about is your utilities and actually developing the land. So for me, I'm in Person County, North Carolina, and there were a few things that I had to do in order to get utilities. One, electricity is going to be the easiest, or at least from my knowledge, because it is typically free. And the reason why electricity is free or getting it from the electrical company is because everyone pays a bill. So when they run a new line from the street to your property, that is basically already paid for in every single bill that you're paying. So they will run that line for free. But one thing you want to think about, which I didn't realize, is they will not turn on any power to your property until you have your full certificate of occupancy, which is at the very end. Sometimes you can get temporary power if you need it, but most of the time they are going to wait until the very end to get your actual power in order to get your certificate of occupancy. On a job site, you might see temporary power, but maybe it made a little bit less sense with my specific property because I also already had power at the cabin. So some of the workers were able to do that when they were building the deck, doing concrete pad and all that good stuff. The next thing that was important was the septic. I had to work with the environmental department at the actual county because there were the people who were telling me the amount of septic that I could add to the land, where I could place all the leach field and the repair zone and all that stuff. And I learned a whole bunch about septic and where all of your waste actually goes. And that in and of itself was definitely quite a big deal and had to have its own permit and had to be in a very specific spot. My goal with this property was to keep the cabin and the tiny home very secluded. They are maybe slightly closer than I anticipated, but they're still very secluded, separated by woods. And it was definitely just a lot more than I thought. And I thought I'd be able to add even an extra one of these tiny homes, but that was definitely not the case with the amount of septic that I was allowed in the area. For me, that covers all of my utilities from the actual, let's call it street, because once you had septic, you still had to connect it to the property. Once we had electric from the electric company, still had to connect it to the actual tiny home. And once I had my well, which was already existing on the property, I still had to cut a new line in order to bring it to the property. And the environmental agency were the people that said I could reuse the same well that I already had for the cabin. The other important thing here that is associated with utilities and clearing land, because obviously I had to clear some land in order to develop this land, put this property here, add the septic, all that good stuff, was working with my zoning department. So the zoning department had other things that I had to do that I did not think about or did not know about, namely stormwater runoff report. I had to get a $1,200 stormwater report from an engineer that says that I am allowed to clear the amount of land that I say I'm going to clear. And he does a 40-page report that has different phosphorus, nitrogen, and all other kinds of levels to say, if I put this much gravel down, impervious surface, clear this many trees, that it isn't going to impact the Neuse River Basin, which is in Raleigh. So if there's a bunch of water runoff, there won't be more floods in a town an hour away from here. So that was something important that I needed to do. And then at the very end, I actually had to get a what was called as-built survey that went over the exact dimensions of everything that I disturbed to show that it was the same as what I originally thought. And again, it was actually a little bit different, but it ended up being fine, and we still got our certificate of occupancy. And then the last thing I had to think about, which I touched on a little bit, was with the building department in terms of all my utilities and permits. So I had to do an initial inspection. The actual tiny home itself had to be certified and put on a permanent foundation, which actually I also had to get an engineer say what a specific permanent foundation is that could be built. Also had to do deck footings and all of that stuff in order to do an initial setup inspection before they could do the rest of the finish, which was the final inspection from the building department before I got the certificate of occupancy. One other hiccup I did run into with the building department is the tiny home that I purchased was certified by a third-party company called NOAA Certifications, and they do certifications for tiny homes on wheels, which is a very specific certification and was not recognized by my county. Now, I was extremely lucky here because I know a few engineers, and the county made me certify that the home was up to North Carolina Residential Building Code. So I was able to talk to one of my engineer friends, and they were able to create me various letters that were sealed with their engineer seal that said it was up to code, the building itself, as well as all of the plumbing, electrical, and all of those fixtures. And they didn't just say that, they actually watched a bunch of videos, and very luckily, NOAA takes videos of the entire process. So they were able to watch those videos. It was about 45 minutes in length of all of these videos to actually know that it was up to the code. And so they felt comfortable putting their stamp of approval on it. So after I had all of that figured out, then I was actually able to develop the land. So those first steps were called pre-construction, which in my opinion and my experience typically takes the longest when you're doing plans, trying to get your initial permit so you're allowed to do that work and you don't get shut down and are doing it legally. It takes the longest amount of time and longest amount of thought For me, that was probably about 6 months, and we had this initial idea a few years ago, but couldn't act on it until we had the funds to start doing it. So that pre-construction took about that 6-month time period, and the rest of it, which was the real construction, took probably 3 or 4 months. So I ended up going with a contractor who ended up doing the septic and the driveway grading and clearing all at once. They did a very okay job. The septic tank itself is slightly unlevel because it sank into the ground. They didn't actually put any dirt back that they were supposed to after the inspection for the septic was done. When they put the initial gravel pad that the tiny home is sitting on, they did it in the wrong spot, and it was probably my own fault for not being here, but I definitely marked it out. And I probably should have been a bit more specific about the plan, so I guess I'll take that one as my own fault. But it was unfortunately not the most amazing, and then they cleared more trees than they thought of. And originally they were saying, make sure you put the home in place first and then we'll bring the septic in. If I could have done it again, I would have wanted them to bring the septic tank in first, because then they wouldn't have had to clear more trees in order to get around it, which was really unfortunate. So that's what ended up happening first before we could get the actual tiny home in place. So really my learning lesson here that I did not have were more specific plans. And I don't just mean having plans, picture something on Google Maps or an aerial view that you can say, place it here. But I would probably go out of your way to take a can of spray paint and actually mark out the specific area where you want everything exactly to be. Because once they clear trees, once they start grading, they can't really undo any of that. The other trades that I had to work with were an electrical trade company. Now, obviously, I had to hook up a 50 amp circuit from the box that the utility company brought out to the tiny home. And then I also added a hot tub, a sauna, and a cold plunge. So those all needed their own specific lines that also had to be inspected by the building department. Another thing I did learn about the whole septic process, and I figured that the actual plumbing that went from the tiny home itself to the septic tank, which was maybe 10 or 15 feet away, just this PVC pipe, I thought that could be done by the septic contractor, and he said that was fine. But when it went time to get my initial inspection, the county would not inspect it because a legal plumber with a plumber license didn't do it. So you have to make sure that that area between the septic and the actual home itself apparently is done by a plumber, or at least talk to your county to see if the septic contractor can do that or not. So that was one thing that delayed the project a little bit as well. And then lastly was the construction, which was the fun part. I had one person do it. He's a really good landscaping contact of mine, and he also did the permanent foundation. He did the whole deck for me, both concrete pads, put in the finished gravel. So he did a really excellent job, and I think he was the best part of the whole process, and that definitely worked out quite well. I obviously had to work with him a little bit to figure out some stuff. He also helped quite a bit with the drainage because this is a fairly wet area. So a lot of the water now goes outside of the pad, which is of course what we want. And one thing I didn't mention about the driveway, definitely make sure if you're doing a gravel driveway or concrete that the contractor is going to put down landscaping tarp beneath it so that a bunch of roots and weeds and dirt and whatever and other kind of stuff don't grow through there. That way you're not going to have to be worrying about spraying them a bunch and trying to kill or pick at a bunch of weeds. So that really was the whole process, and once all of the construction was done, I could get my final inspection, and that was about 3 or 4 months after the tiny home actually made its way onto this land, and then I could turn on the electricity. And it was unfortunate that I had to wait that long to turn on the electricity because it was June, July here when we did not have electricity, and it was very hot in North Carolina. So we did minimal work when we could, and then as soon as we had the electricity and could turn on the air conditioning, we started getting after it. And now I'm planning on actually listing this property on Airbnb in about a week. We've taken all exterior photos, but about to take more interior photos this weekend. Mia is my photographer. I don't do that myself, and she edits it, so it works out really well, but she does have a day job, so we have to stick to doing it on the weekend. So thanks for watching. Hopefully that was helpful. If you ever decide to take a property or land and turn it into something, like you can have a tiny home, potentially listed on Airbnb, or live in it yourself. If you did enjoy that video, definitely subscribe to learn more about real estate investing or the agent business, and like the video if you haven't already done so. And thanks again for watching, and more wealth is coming your way.